It is 1 a.m. on a Friday night, and the Mothers of Invention are recording part of the soundtrack for their forthcoming movie. Ian is playing harpsichord and Bunk is playing the flute. They huddle together in a cluster of microphones, Bunk leaning over Ian's shoulder to read the music propped up on the harpsichord stand. Bunk wears a goatee and a matching mustache, and his long thick hair is gray. In the studio light it looks like a powdered wig. Resembling a figure in an old etching, he bends closer to Ian, his flute poised, and Ian straightens his back and places his fingers on the harpsichord keys. Poised like musicians at a 19th century musicale, they wait for a signal to begin. One feels they are waiting to play a Mozart sonata. Inside the control booth, Frank Zappa, wearing a t-shirt bearing the legend Herzl Camp, Garner, Wisconsin, is fiddling with knobs on the control board. "You're going to have to do the parody notes more staccato, Ian," he says through the intercom. "You want a little bebop vibrato on that too?" calls Ian. "Yeah, a little bebop-a-go-go," says Frank. Dick Kunk, the engineer, flips the record switch. Sally Kempton, describing the recording sessions for Uncle Meat in the book The Age of Rock. Flash forward to September 1970, and it's my first day of high school. I'm intrigued by the Mothers of Invention albums that I've seen in the stores. They have such bizarre and interesting looking covers, but no song titles or other information on the outside, so I really didn't know what to make of them. I ran into a classmate on that first day of school who was carrying around a copy of the Mothers of Invention Mother Mania album, and asked, "What is it? What are they like?" And she said, "They're fantastic." So I decided the next chance I got, I was going to buy a Mothers of Invention album, and that happened to be a visit to the Fedco department store in San Diego, and I picked out the album that happened to be a double LP coming with a booklet because that looked like a good deal, and that was Uncle Meat. I was blown away, and there's a lot to say about this album, so I'm not going to go through all the tracks, but just give some impressions and some information about the album. The first thing you'll see is that the cover collage by Cal Schenkel has a lot of teeth and dental illustrations in it, and that was because his studio was in a former dental office, and he actually found the materials for this cover as things that were left behind by the previous occupants. Uncle Meat was a particularly ambitious album, even by Zappa's standards, and an incredibly eclectic album ranging through chamber music, jazz, musique concrète and electronics, 50s rock and roll and doo-wop. A little bit of everything from Zappa's menu is on here, so as an introduction, this was a mind-blower for me. The electronic sounds are partially created through the use of a Maestro woodwind system that the woodwind players in the band could play through, and it would provide a tracking signal in parallel with their sound, maybe at various octaves. And you can hear that when Bunk Gardner plays a solo on King Kong that's doubled 2 octaves below by the woodwind effect. There was also a device used that they rigged up in the Apostolic studio called the Apostolic Blurch Injector. And this was basically a box with 3 buttons on it, which passed a signal from a tape of very distorted, overloaded sounds, and it would allow them just to create these explosive bursts of electronic noise. So whenever you hear these little jolts of sound on the album, that comes from the Blurch Injector. There are also the use of snorks, which is basically a noise made by members of the band. The chamber music ambitions that Zappa had, the very classical ideas, and very complex and not traditionally tonal ideas were beyond the capability of many of the members of the band. So this album relies very heavily on the ones who had formal musical training and could read music fluently, which meant Bunk Gardner on woodwinds, Art Tripp on percussion, and Ian Underwood on woodwinds and keyboards. And they were joined by the guest player Ruth Komanoff on marimba and vibraphone, who later married Ian Underwood and became better known to us as Ruth Underwood from the 70s lineups of the Mothers. The album was recorded in 1967 through 68 primarily at Apostolic Studios in New York. There are also parts recorded in Hollywood, and there are live recordings from Europe. Inside the booklet, there's the story of the Uncle Meat movie. It was recorded with the intention of being the soundtrack of a movie, which never really got made, although some years later, many years later, there was something put together as a direct-to-video release. The album was recorded simultaneously with the album Cruisin' with Reuben and the Jets, Zappa's homage to 50s doo-wop and greasy rock and roll. An important part of Frank Zappa's aesthetic throughout his career is the idea of conceptual continuity, which basically means that he considered everything that he did, whether it was an album or a concert or an interview, as part of one big artistic lifetime statement. And that was all tied together with recurring themes. And on the Uncle Meat album, he uses recurring themes to tie the whole album together. There are 4 main tunes that we hear repeated at different points on the album. The first being Uncle Meat itself, which is first presented as track 1 on the album, Uncle Meat main title theme, which already is divided into 2 parts, presenting the theme in different formats. That reappears as the Uncle Meat variations and as the Legend of the Golden Arches, and I think it's also referred to or referenced in Zolar Kazakal. The next theme is Dog Breath, which is the first vocal piece on the album, first actual song type piece, and that reappears as Dog Breath variations. Then there's A Pound for a Brown on the Bus, which has a title referring to the act of mooning out the window of a bus. And the pound is a British pound that one of the band members bet Bunk Gardner that he wouldn't dare to moon out the window of their tour bus. And of course he did, because, hey, a pound is a pound when you're making as little money as the Mothers of Invention did. The fourth theme is King Kong, which takes up side 4 of the LP. That's a jazz piece in 3/8 time. And it's prefigured on the album with Prelude to King Kong, which is a jam based on the King Kong theme, but very freely presented and set in 5/8 time. They had this very specific 5/8 beat that they would use that went bop, 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 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. You hear that, and then you hear that same beat on a track called Ian Underwood Whips It Out, which is a live recording of just his saxophone solo from a version of King Kong, using that same 5/8 beat in the background. Dog Breath in the Year of the Plague on LP is in 3 parts. The main song part, then a weird middle section as described in the liner notes, and finally a theme that is prefiguring A Pound for a Brown on the Bus. When this album was released on CD, that Pound for a Brown on the Bus theme was no longer tracked as part of Dog Breath. It was tracked as the first section of The Legend of the Golden Arches. The song Dog Breath was also released as a single, actually a single B-side. This is a German copy. The single edition had no lead vocals. It was just the instrumental and backing vocals from the album version of Dog Breath in the Year of the Plague. Here's a French release of the same coupling. This doesn't say dog breath on the front. And here is a Mexican pressing, Aliento Canino. Frank Zappa is credited with all the compositions on this, which is a little naughty because it includes variations performed live of Louie Louie and God Bless America, which, shock horror, Frank Zappa did not write. There are spoken word sections, The Voice of Cheese and Our Bizarre Relationship, which contain F-bombs, so you may not want to play those in front of your maiden aunt. Sleeping in a Jar is a piece that was part of a live set known as the String Quartet. The melody of Sleeping in a Jar, which is presented here with lyrics, was combined with the melody of A Pound for Brown on the Bus as that string quartet piece, performed not with a real string quartet, but just by the Mothers on various concerts. Frank Zappa has acknowledged the influence on Uncle Meat of the music of Conlon Nancarrow, who wrote music for player pianos. He found that by punching the paper rolls by hand, using very careful measurements, he could create music with impossibly complex rhythms and use as many fingers to play the piano as he desired. This is a British copy of the LP on the Transatlantic label. It's got the British hype sticker on it with the bargain price in British currency. And this version has the track 9 Types of Industrial Pollution titled 400 Days of the Year on the label. I'm not sure what the story is behind the change of title. The title 400 Days of the Year refers to one of Frank Zappa's earliest records from back in the pre-Mothers of Invention days when he was writing singles for various artists, and he did a single for Bob Guy, who was a horror movie producer, or horror movie host, I mean to say. And the monologue that Zappa wrote for him included that phrase. Here's a white label promo copy. This does not have the 400 Days of the Year title on the label. I understand that there are American copies that do, but even though obviously the white label is from the very first run, it has 9 Types of Industrial Pollution on the label. It has the hype sticker that appeared on the cellophane of the regular version. And I'm handling it very gingerly because this cover is trashed and the seams are completely split and torn on the first disc side. So there's the white label. Side 3 begins with Mr. Green Jeans, and that's presented here as a slow, dirge-like piece. On Frank Zappa's next album, the solo album Hot Rats, he would reprise that theme in another instance of conceptual continuity as Son of Mr. Green Jeans, where it would be more cheerful and majestic sounding, with, of course, a jazz treatment, as all the tracks on that album have. And The Air is a sort of variation on the kind of doo-wop 50s rock and roll homage that he did with the simultaneous Reuben and the Jets album, but here with more surrealistic lyrics than he gave. And Cruising for Burgers is the last vocal piece on the album. Finally, side 4 is taken up by King Kong, which is a long jazz piece in 6 sections. King Kong itself, as played by the Mothers in the studio. King Kong, its magnificence as interpreted by Dom DeWilde, which is the nickname for Don Preston, and this is his piano solo. King Kong, as Motorhead explains it, Motorhead's saxophone solo. King Kong, the Gardner Varieties, and that's the track where Gardner is playing one instrument that's being doubled by the electronic device at lower octave. King Kong is played by 3 deranged good humor trucks. Then it's spliced into a live performance, King Kong live on a flatbed diesel in the middle of a racetrack at the Miami Pop Festival, the Underwood Ramifications. All right, so that's Uncle Meat. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye for now.